Yeah, so basically, all what I wanted to talk about was partly just thinking about, well, it's teaching Singapore's history, but thinking about it in terms of maritime and imperial. I was really referring to this work, so Empire in Asia. I think you have the chapter available, which is my work, but also just to talk about why this project for me was quite challenging in some ways, because I was tasked with thinking about empire in terms of maritime history. And the way that I began to sort of consider that was to explore how did the British understand maritime power, right, and the nature of their own empire. And one of the things that I came to was looking at Victorian notions. So the Victorian era is the 1800s through to about we say 1914, sort of First World War, even though Queen Victoria has died, partly just because there's continuity, right? So the Victorian era. In the Victorian era in particular, the British are unrivaled as a maritime power. They have this extensive network of ports. They have not just naval power, but commercial dominance over the waters. I mean, you do have other European powers with major shipping companies, such as the Hamburg Line. The Dutch have been sort of shipping companies and interests, but the British are really the preeminent maritime power, both in terms of naval and commercial presence. And they do this partly through the establishment of they've got colonial territories, but colonial port cities become these sort of entry points. Right? So that's where, this is what I was trying to explore in my chapter in Maritime Goes Global. One of the points that I explored was, how did the British understand this? And this is where I came to the idea of the thalassocracy, which is a Greek idea. So it's going back to Greek Empire. And basically, the way that I see it is that the British looked at empire building and they looked back at the ancient world. And they said to themselves, well, we don't want to be like the Romans, because the Romans are too territorial. They're really ruthless. We are a much more sort of benevolent empire. So we're a bit more like the Greeks with their maritime power. And this is the way that they tried to position themselves. And you have a lot of writers of the Victorian era talking about how maritime power is a much more forceful good. It's not as destructive as one which is so land-based. I mean, the reality is the British were, they had an empire which spanned the globe. But the way that Victorian scholars and writers began to envision themselves was as a maritime power. So this is what I found really fascinating, is that you have scholars such as Sir John Seeley, and these are scholars of the Victorian era, writing about the triumph of the seas, that only the British can master the waters, and that port cities are part of that demonstration of the mastery of the waters. Right, so it's thinking about, and this is what in the chapter looking at Maritime Goes Global, is this idea that the British, through a maritime networks, through their naval forces and their commercial shipping interests, really did create a network which was, it was maritime. It was supported through infrastructure such as port development, banking, telecommunications. So you've got the laying of undersea cables, for instance, steamship technology. All of this supported British maritime interests, whether they are of a naval or a commercial base. It led to the development of very substantial colonial port cities, and Singapore is one of the great examples. And these port cities, and if we're looking at these port cities, there is a sort of a celebration of what is seen as the modern Asian port. And Singapore is really seen as a great example of this, where you have this notion that traditional port cities, and again, Singapore was highlighted as an example of a traditional trading emporium back in the Temasek era that was revived under British guidance. Right? So you've got this sort of narrative which is built in to Victorian sensibilities and Victorian understandings of the Asian maritime realm. And you've got this celebration of what is considered the great colonial port cities of Asia. So places like Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, then you have Penang, but of course Penang is eclipsed. So ports So you've got Penang, Singapore, Hong Kong. These would be some of the big examples. Ports always work in a dynamic within a network. So Singapore emerges in Southeast Asia as the preeminent of the ports. Penang and Malacca very much become sort of subsidiary. But it's this idea that once you have the emergence of colonial ports, their significance is reinforced through the infrastructure, through the investment. Steamships only stop at key ports of call. So once you are one of those selected ports of call, all the investments and all the infrastructure tends to funnel towards these ports. So if we think about it in terms of, and this is bringing Singapore into the picture, in terms of Singapore, what makes sense then is if Singapore becomes a port of call, then you build the coaling sheds, you build the infrastructure for the steamships, you make sure you have adequate communication, so that the undersea cables, for instance, you build the infrastructure which is required. So it basically consolidates the role of the particular port. So this is what happens during the 1800s, but really picks up pace after the opening of the Suez Canal.